Hello everyone and welcome to the Topical Hour. Control is quite possibly the weirdest game ever made, which is interesting considering it came after a game like Alan Wake 1. And when I say weird, I mean the gameplay, story, plot, and subject material in general. Everything is a little bit weird. Most of the time that's what the game is going for, but sometimes it kind of gets in the way of itself. But before you start commenting on numbers and sales, the failure of this game is not that it didn't sell well. And it's actually kind of interesting how it failed, but first we should discuss the story and plot. The protagonist is Jessie Faden. Her and her brother, Dylan, find a slide projector that leads to alternate dimensions. This leads to an altered world event, or an AWE, that leads to the top secret Federal Bureau of Control taking Dylan away and trying to take Jessie, but she escapes. But an entity from one of the alternate dimensions latches itself to Jessie, giving her powers in a paranatural sense. This allows her to find the Bureau of Control years later when she's an adult. So, the premise of the game is that she's trying to find her brother Dylan. And when she gets to the Bureau, which most people can't even see, the building immediately goes into lockdown because of some threat. Now, the building itself is called the Oldest House and sits in the middle of New York, obscured from most people's view like the Mist and the Percy Jackson books. It's a lot bigger on the inside than the outside, so the entire game is set here, but the location never gets stale or boring. I'm not going to go over all of the terminology because I'm assuming you've played the game before. You need to know about AWEs, objects of power, altered items, the FBC, and things like that. But the story itself has a lot of problems. First of all, the game has trouble establishing what or who we should trust. Like, for such a cynical person, Jessie ends up trusting Emily Pope, Langston, and even Darling way too quickly. And I think that's a big problem with this story. The game's quick. Like, you do 10 main missions in total and the game ends so abruptly and with so little conclusion that you might be genuinely confused when the credits roll. At least the second time. Granted, there are a lot of side missions and some DLC which we'll get to later, but this game had a budget of $30 million, which just doesn't feel real sometimes. And I think this is a good time to talk about the gameplay. First of all, the Oldest House itself is a technical marvel. I'm not sure how it runs on last gen because this game came out before the PS5, which when you look at all the breakable objects in the game is just shocking. Like, most things are realistically breakable across the entire game. All the drawers open, all the TVs explode, and just how big the Oldest House is does not feel connected to a $30 million budget. I think where you can really feel the limitations are probably in a lot of the side missions where there's not usually anything specifically made for the missions. It's usually just a mission set somewhere in the building where you cleanse and chase an object. You can also feel the limitations when characters talk to each other. The voice acting is honestly some of the best and most natural dialogue I've ever heard, but I'm usually distracted by how strange some of the voice sync can be. By the way, this is your reminder to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying. Thank you. But back to the actual gameplay, I think it's a little weird on Remedy's part to make games like this and Alan Wake third-person shooters. I'm not sure what the gameplay should be, but I don't know if the story and plot mesh very well with the game elements. Like, it's really weird to talk about side missions and shootouts in a game where everything is set in one building that's essentially SCP headquarters. It doesn't help that the different weapons you can use boil down to a really good pistol, a shotgun, machine gun, sniper, and some other ones that I'm pretty sure no one uses. That is to say, most of the service weapon variants are kinda useless, and I feel like there should have been different enemy interactions between each weapon rather than just one as a shotgun and one as a pistol. I also feel that the game puts a lot of emphasis on making you feel powerful sometimes, but other times it really tries to limit you. Like, when I'm flying around tearing enemies apart like they're nothing, that's kind of cool. But when flying enemies always dodge my first throwable object attack, it just makes me feel like I have to throw more. It's more annoyance than challenge. I also think, and this is something I believe about many games and enemies, is that if an enemy has a tough shield, they have no reason to have a ton of health unless it's a boss fight. When brute enemies have shields that refresh every 2 seconds, when enemies are dodging my attacks along with being fast and hard to hit in general, I'm not having a challenging time, I'm not dying over and over. It's really just stretching every encounter. I actually found myself kind of annoyed each time enemies would spawn in a random part of the Oldest House, because there's not a level up system in this game, it's a resource gain system. You're not rewarded for encounters past source points in some materials, but you can only get specific materials from designated places in the Oldest House. So when I'm trying to look for a side mission and I'm ambushed by enemies, I feel like I'm wasting my time rather than playing a fun game. Especially when they're dodging my attacks or regenerating a shield every 4 frames of the game. Now, that's not to say it's all bad. When you flow in a combat encounter, you flow. Throwing things, using shields, switching service weapons, floating around, brainwashing enemies, it can be a blast. It's a lot better when there's a metric ton of weaker enemies who I'm defending from and feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume. That's cool. I really don't like it when there's like 2 minigun brutes with refreshing shields that demolish me in 2 shots. It's not a skill issue, I can beat either scenario. But I have more more fun with the first one from the way the game is set up. But let's go back to the story a bit. I do think that this game kinda plays the same role that Spider-Man 2018 does for that franchise, where the first game is really solid, but it's more of a springboard for the next games. Control is like that, to where most of the game just works on establishing the kind of world it sits in. Because even though this is technically set in the world of Alan Wake, it's a whole different beast in itself. When it comes to the story, we find Dylan has been taken over by the Hist, we cleanse him, and that's like the whole story. The rest of it is world building with the other FBC members and doing fetch quest crap to get there, along with some Hedron Polaris stuff. And that's why I think that the story of Control kinda sucks. I think this is slightly fixed by the DLC, but the base game story sucks. I think the draw for most people is the lore and world building. I read every single case file and bit of correspondence, something I have a lot of trouble with in other games, and by far the best part of this game is the Dr. Darling videos. It includes world building, genuinely funny bits, genuinely haunting prospects about our world, especially that last one. The way that he's so goofy and fun sometimes, and then he's extremely disturbed by something he won't even elaborate on. The best part, we never specifically find out what happens to him, and we only interact with him once through an interdimensional telephone. This game's pretty weird, by the way. His performance and those cute stylized videos were always a joy to find, and all of the case files and correspondence were extremely weird but always entertaining and creative. It's like reading SCP entries but with more rules and honestly more conceptually cool most of the time. Reading about AWEs, listening to chilling audio clips, I'd sometimes save up all of my collectibles to read later because there's a ton across the entire game. What the story lacks, the lore and world building makes up for. And that's why I'm genuinely anticipating the sequel for this game, because it'll probably have the budget and freedom to really go crazy. I really didn't think the combat lived up to how weird the game and lore can be, so there's a disconnect there, but I don't think that'll be the case next time. As for the DLC, I actually really like them for the most part. I like the Foundation. I think it's a bit stretched by just how many encounters there are, but it's an actual continuation of the story that ties up some loose ends, which is nice. The boss fight new abilities are cool, the new lore and world building aspects, everything involving the nail on the board especially. I do feel that the red caves get a little tired on the eyes after a while, but it's not a bad departure from the other occasionally sterile feeling sectors. I think everything with Marshall is actually pretty cool, although a little bleak for the character, and like I said, the fight's fun. As for the other DLC, AWE, which I didn't even know was about Alan Wake until I played it, I liked it a lot better. It's probably because I just got through the first Alan Wake, and so I was excited to return to that world and character. But it was cool to almost get a continuation of that story, but for it to still be Control's thing. Like, yes, we're using Alan Wake's Dr. Hartman, but most of the continuation aspect comes from collectibles and teases. We only get a couple of hotline calls from Wake himself, all of which are pretty freaking cool from the way that he narrates in some of his writing. But really, the focus is on the Hiss-infected Hartman rather than just more Alan Wake. But the collectibles still add a couple of suggestions and teases about Cauldron Lake having started out as like a magical flood that came out of nowhere, things that sometimes even contradict each other, but are interesting threads to follow up on. I like the new investigation sector. It's fun to explore and makes a bit more sense than the Foundation as a DLC that was here the whole time, but we just couldn't access it. The boss fight's pretty good, although the thing that was Hartman running away like 4 times was annoying. The new gameplay mechanics with darkness are also cool, and the new service weapon variant is still useless, but I'm glad that it's there, I guess. And I love the way that it sets up the next Control game in Alan Wake 2, which I'm going to play myself soon. However, I really wish that the FBI agent on the poster was an FBC agent. I know, I haven't played the game, I don't know how Saga being an FBI agent works into the story, but I don't really care. The way AWE ended, it sounded like an Agent Estevez was going to investigate the AWE in Bright Falls. That could have gone seamlessly into the next Alan Wake game. But no, we didn't do that for some reason. I've heard that Alan Wake 2 is like one of the best stories ever made, so I'll trust that this is for the best, but I still think it should have been an FBC agent. And if I don't hear anything about Control in Alan Wake 2, I'm gonna be upset. I think the last thing I'd like to discuss is the aesthetic of this game, just a little bit. I love the retro aesthetic here. I don't usually like using that word, but I think it fits pretty well in this game. The agents using World War II weapons, all of the computers and things looking like they were ripped out of the Loki TV show. And the reason stated for this is just because the oldest house doesn't like new technology, which is just so cool and weird and already initiates so many questions. Weird side note, but the red design of everything Hiss-related does wear on the eyes sometimes and can make it really hard to see during combat encounters before you clear one of the more important control points. But I do have a genuine love for the aesthetic of this game. It looks really cool and creative in a sterile and uninviting way. A game about the strange and weird that has a really mundane surface. But then, on top of the aesthetic, is the bleak outlooks by the FBC in general. It's like even though the Bureau is there to save lives, they never seem to care very much about when people die and view it as some flaw the system is supposed to fix rather than a horrible tragedy. Especially because when someone dies, it's usually the most horrific means of death you've ever heard. Like the guy who was ripped apart by the altered refrigerator, and then his boss barely cares at all. In fact, his boss seems to care more about the altered items than his subordinates, and it can be kind of dryly funny sometimes, but other times it's just a very weird outlook on how this world works. Especially in Dr. Darling's case, he seems to barely care about some of the moral implications of what he's doing, especially where Dylan Faden's training as the new director is concerned. It's also weird that Dylan has to undergo barbaric preparations, but Jesse is just named director immediately on entrance to the FBC. But that's either a little nitpick or something I don't completely understand. I guess the way this game failed, or what held it back from being one of the greats in recent history, was the fact that it didn't mesh well with its gameplay and story. Like, all of the ads for this game, outside of gameplay trailers of course, would never tell you that this is a third-person shooter. I mean, if I explain the entire plot to you, you'd never guess that I'm describing the plot of a third-person shooter, especially when the majority of the problems lie in the third-person shooter part. And I do believe that the combat is good, even a hair's width away from being masterful, but because it's so detached from the story and how the rest of the game works, it still ends up holding it back. Also, it's weird, but I think the lore in general is just weirdly tied with the gameplay. It's like, why am I shooting an interdimensional being with a gun? A weird gun, sure, but still a gun. And the gameplay systems and mechanics in general keep the story from being super weird, which I think it could have gone down that path a bit more. As weird and large scale as the issues and enemies are in this world, it still comes down to you shooting it with a gun, or cleansing it, or throwing rocks and stuff at it. All that said, I think this game gets a 7.5 out of 10. A lot of the problems are just a little bit too much to ignore, but all of the good stuff is so cool and unique, and I really hope a lot of it returns in the next game. While I do believe Control is one of the weirdest games I've ever played, and probably the weirdest game ever made, that's probably its biggest strength as well. And in the sequel, all we need is a few oldest house rumblings and shifts, and we have another fresh experience that hopefully improves upon this game just a little bit to make it a truly great experience. But, as always, if you enjoyed, I'd appreciate it if you'd like the video and subscribe to the channel. Or not, that's fine. Play nice, people.